Everybody, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. I'll just give people another minute to join before we get started. So it's great to see so much interest tonight. Thanks for spending your time when you could rather be watching the news or having a good time outside. Okay, I think we might get going because I know people's time's precious. So thank you once again for joining us. I know many of you, but for those who I haven't met, my name's Grant Davidson. I'm the CEO of Hauora Taiwhenua, the Rural Health Network. I'm not clinical. I've got a PhD in risk management, and that's probably quite appropriate in this discussion here tonight in many ways, but very much relying on the expertise of the group here to provide feedback for the work that we're doing. But I'd just like to start tonight's meeting with karakia so that we focus our energies on the work at hand. So, me karakia te whānau. Whakataka tahau ki te uru, whakataka tahau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina te uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, e he aki ana te atakura, hei teo, hei hoka, hei hauhu, ti hei mōri ora. Thanks, everyone. And I'm not going to get everyone to introduce themselves. I think we just get into the meat of the meeting. The invitation that went out gave the purpose of the meeting, and it's twofold. The first is that the Medical Council are currently doing a review of supervision requirements for IMGs, and I'm one of the people on there. I see Sam Merton's online, but Luke Bradford represents the college on that review group as well. And this review isn't about supervision of GPEP requirements. This is specifically about IMGs who have multiple pathways that they can apply to get into a registration with the Medical Council. And earlier today, I sent out a PDF of those various pathways, and hopefully you will have had a look at that, and you can refer to that if you need to. And the second part of the meeting is about the government's announcement to increase the number of NZREX graduates who into general practice, with the goal of getting 100 of them across the line within the next 2 years. There has been a pilot in the Waikato of 10, of which 7 have stayed in the system working in general practice. One's working in hospitals out of that 10, and the other 2 dropped out of the system. But a 70% retention rate is actually pretty good, as long as they're working at a great standard. So the ministry have approached us and want to know what barriers we need to remove in terms of getting a good proportion of that 100 training and then hopefully staying to work in rural general practice. So that's the second part of the discussion. So just as background, hopefully you realise that overall there is a shortage of general practitioners in the whole of New Zealand, but in rural in particular, where our estimate is that we're 150 FTE short, and with many working only part-time, that's actually a lot more short in terms of warm bodies on the ground. So we've got a major issue. The government acknowledged that, and they also acknowledged that we're not training enough in total, and that's a separate issue, but their solution is to import trained doctors. That's the IMG route and the NZREX route. And if we can't get enough, then they're going to build the comprehensive primary care teams through nurse practitioners, physician associates and others. So that's another conversation again, but we're wanting to try to get as many general practitioners into the system as possible and willing to work and stay in rural. Another part of the picture is 26% of rural practices don't have a registered fellow in them. So they're staffed by non-fellows and often quite experienced. So there's some conversations there around, can those people be involved in supervision? And if they can't, how are we going to meet the requirements if there has to be on-site supervision by a fellow at all times? Many of those general practices are sole practitioner practices or actually owner-operated practices, and the Medical Council has seen those doctors as having a conflict of interest as being employers and supervisors, and therefore ruled out of the ability to be the primary supervisor. And over 50% of those GPs working in rural practice are part-time in their roles. The other background is there's an increasing use of IT for consults, either within practice or contracted telehealth services, and that IT's improving daily in terms of its ability to have multiple screens, monitoring the patient and monitoring the doctor working. So does that increase our ability to provide adequate supervision? The Medical Council's premise in this review is right touch. So that's having an appropriate level of supervision for the risk that the presenting doctor presents based on their qualifications and experience, the country they're coming from, etc. And they're proposing that that supervision level ranges from highly on-site supervised through to mentorship, which is fairly light touch. And all of those discussions are up for grabs at the moment. So that's the context. And I presented the group with a number of questions that I want to go through tonight. And I know that there are going to be a range of views, and all of those views are valid. And the feedback that I will give the Medical Council will portray the range of views that the group are putting here today. And so, plus we're offering the ability, Graham and Gemma as co-chairs of the Rural General Practice chapter have offered to take any written feedback or verbal feedback, and we'll throw that all into the pot and come up with a summary of the feedback that we get in relation to those questions that are put to us today. Any immediate questions?
Grant, Mark Wills here. I'm intrigued that the Ministry of Health was leading this. I thought that the Medical Council drove the supervision requirements.
So sorry, the Medical Council is driving the supervision requirements. The NZREX questions are coming from Health New Zealand, not related to supervision requirements, related to other barriers that might be affecting being able to place NZREX satisfactorily into rural general practice. I'm sorry if I would confuse that, Mark.
No trouble. Just it's good that there's some progress being made on this, because it seems like we're heading to an impractical outcome in the current trajectory.
Thank you. Caitlin.
Kia ora team, sorry, I'm balancing kids and things tonight. I was just wondering, the whole thing around people who are sole practitioners not being able to supervise, has there been any bigger kind of picture in terms of these new doctors being employed centrally by Te Hauora or Health New Zealand, so they aren't employed by the general practice, so the supervision conflict is not there?
That's currently not an option, Caitlin, but thank
Dreams
you.
are free.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting discussion. going forward. Any other background questions? AR, whoever you are, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, Andrew Ralston. I was just curious. I'm just a bit unfamiliar with the model, how it's done. Is the IMGs role funded, and is the teaching and things that they need, is that funded as well, or how's that all work?
Who would like to answer that question? Brendan.
Yeah, thanks. We were part of the pilot, so I'm not too sure moving forward if what the conditions of the pilot would be used moving forward. But the IMGs were employed by the Health New Zealand, Waikato DHB, and we had a small stipend for providing supervision.
Yeah, that's the NZREX pilot that Brendan's referring to, and the general practice, I think, got $3,600, which was the stipend, and the NZREX's salaries were paid. But if it's a normal IMG arrangement where an international doctor's coming over and moving to New Zealand, practice would enter a contract with them and employ them, and there is no extra money for supervision. Any other questions before we move on? Oh, Graham.
Evening. Thanks, Grant. Just want to clarify the New Zealand Medical Council investigation is pan colleges. It's not specific to us. So we need to recognize this as multidisciplinary across primary and hospital-based specialist services, urban and rural. So, obviously, if we're going to hold the government to account to rural proofing and rural as a priority population, we may need to consider whether there are rurally focused specific lens onto this question, not just a panacea for all ills.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. That's true. The expert advisory group in this review represents or has representatives from a range of the other colleges on board, and they'll be looking at this from a pan specialist view. Yep. All right, well, if that's the immediate questions, and I know we've already used 15 minutes of our allotted hour, I think it'd be great to move on to that range of questions. And so it seems to work pretty well if you raise your hands, if you've got a question or a comment in this case. So, and we'll be making notes, and this is being recorded, so be aware of that as well. First question is, what constitutes effective supervision and what is it designed to achieve? Now, just as background, the current Medical Council supervision guidance document says the purpose of supervision enables an IMG's performance to be assessed over time while they become familiar with A, the New Zealand health system, and B, the required standard of practice. So that's currently the stated purpose. Is that still appropriate? Would people want changes to that? Additions? No comment means it's great.
Yeah. Look, Rex is trying to say something.
What happens in remote rural practices that don't have a vocationally registered doctor working in them? Are they still able to supervise international medical graduates?
The supervision requirements would mean that they would have to have a primary supervisor that's in a nearby practice, and that for a period of time, the IMG would have to work either in their practice or the supervisor would have to come to the post-practice and work alongside them. So it is possible, but it's quite onerous.
Yeah.
It's Mark Wills here again. That's the requirement that's causing us quite a lot of grief around the country. And your point, Grant, about the availability of technology now seems to have escaped this discussion thus far around the ability for clinicians who might be supervising to see the notes and the quality of content that that doctor might have completed, and to have the conversations with them, and even including patients in situ, because they could join by video remotely, to enable this to be far and wide availability of supervision. We've already tested some of this stuff within our network, and it seems to work very, very well.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And I think we're jumping slightly ahead because I just want to confirm that the purpose, and then we'll move on, and if no one's going to change it. So it says, because this is very vital to whether remote will work or not. The purpose is enabling an IMG's performance to be assessed over time while they become familiar with the New Zealand health system and the required standard of practice. It doesn't state in the purpose that they step in to take clinical charge if required. Does that need to be in the purpose? Because if it is, that's very different in terms of meeting the requirements of supervision. Keen to get your thoughts there. If they have to be able to step in, then the ability to have remote supervision becomes no longer a talking point.
No, Rex, you'll hear.
Yes.
Nobody's talking. Remote rural practices face significant difficulty if a doctor is ill or something happens and they're no longer available. You can't just get another practitioner in like that. It's not like in a city. And it is difficult to be supervising some distance away because you take yourself out of your practice, which further compounds the problems in your own practice when you're going visiting the other practice.
Thanks, Rex. Sam?
Yeah, I just wonder if we think about this from a perspective of if any of us went and worked remotely in another country, what would we want for our own supervision, and would, if we knew our job, so theoretically we employ people coming from overseas, or we would get employed for a job that we knew we could do. So we think we know we can do it. If, as Grant says, this is about understanding the health system and meeting the standard, like someone can tell that we are doing the job right. I don't think that does mean that someone steps in, but I think also as an expectation, if I was working in somewhere that was remote by myself in the outback of Canada, what level of support would I want and how would that be done for me is the sort of thing that we need to think about for this process. And so these are people who supposedly, if they're employed, have got the skills. We just need to make sure that they're fitting in and they feel like they're safe, as well as we can see that their patients are safe. And when we talk about college stuff, that's much more about training, not necessarily about someone who's already got skills for the job and has been employed to do a particular role.
Thank you. Brendan? Oh, you're muted, Brendan. Sorry.
Yeah, 2 points. One, feeding off from Sam's comments, I guess the other thing is, what would a supervisor require to be satisfied that they were comfortable with what their trainee or person they were supervising was achieving. And secondly, I guess, and just a little bit, wondering about clarification around the expectation of the IMGs. Would they be going into a practice for the full 18 months to be supervised and then finish up, or more like the NZREX program where they rotated through 6-month placements? Because I could see a kind of a scope for that first 6 months, maybe more intensive on-site supervision, and then once they've done their first 6 months, moving out into a less supervised environment. But I'm not too sure what the plan is for this moving forward.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. And we're talking generally here in this first part about IMGs who have taken on a contract with the practice and will be there for whatever the contracted period is. And for some IMGs, it might be a 6-month, a year, or 18-month, or they plan to move there forever until they get a better offer. Yeah, but it's different than the NZREX, which might be going through a number of 6-month placements in a CBA type environment. Graham.
Yeah, I think just going back to your first question, we need surely an adjunct definition about what we feel adequate supervision looks like, particularly in resource constraint and rural environment. So maybe we need to ensure that there's an extension on that. And the second thing is working out with the reality of multidisciplinary team-based work, that, whether we need to be clearly defining the various roles that we now believe are competent to provide adequate supervision. You have a well-qualified nurse practitioner or a rural hospitalist as opposed to a rural general practitioner. So maybe we need to be teasing out and being actually much more specific and recognizing the changing environment in which we work, rather than just resting back on a definition that was determined 20 years ago and didn't ever envisage telehealth or remote supervision. Thanks.
Thank you. Caitlin?
Yeah, I think one other key point to it all as well is just remembering, like, each individual context is so important, and each individual clinician, there's not going to be a one size model fits all. And I think it's said there about the right touch, but just as an example, we've got 2 American family physicians right now, husband and wife, came from exactly the same context at exactly the same practice now with us, and their orientation and their supervision is entirely different. And you could say, well, that's, from the US, they meet so many different and similar criteria, but they are just so different. And it's been a real lesson learned in terms of supervision. So I think there's going to have to be some overarching themes, but realizing that it's going to have to be so individual.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely appreciate that.
Grant.
Martin.
Yeah. Picking up on what Sam was saying about imagining being out on your own, I can't imagine remote supervision working without a good pair of eyes and ears on site, much in the way that Graham was describing. If we think realistically about those doctors who've crossed our paths and we're thinking, hey, this isn't going well, it's a gut feeling that gathered together from all the people within the practice. So if you're going to have remote supervision, I mean, any of us can pull the wool pretty much with remote conversations. It's what wise people like nurses, even receptionists, I shouldn't even say even, nurses, receptionists, and others feel about how is this going. On top of that, of course, you want to look at the technicalities of, are there issues for patients? Are the notes being done adequately? And you need to have, I think, a vocationally trained GP to be looking at that whole picture using the eyes and ears on site. I can't imagine an IMG coming and being literally alone in a remote place in New Zealand without those other eyes and ears alongside. So again, as Caitlin's saying, you match it in using the resources you've got creatively. But I suspect from the college's point of view and the council's point of view, there does need to be a college fellow who is playing the role of overall supervision. The funding's another matter, but there we go.
Thank you. Okay, we're all keen on getting ahead in the questions. I'm going to move on now. The purpose sounds about right. Let's move on to the second question, which is, do you agree with creating various scales of supervision or mentorship depending on the registration pathway? And the example the Medical Council are giving at the moment, and you can refer to that PDF diagram I sent you today, is if you take a vocational pathway, which is down the bottom of that diagram, whereby the doctor, the IMG, has got the medical degree plus vocational registration in their country plus experience, and they're going through a vocational registration, which will be the equivalent of achieving fellowship registration with the college here, that they would be more appropriately mentored as opposed to having really intense supervision. So that is the question that the Medical Council is putting forward, because they believe the risk is less there, so the supervision should be less.
Well, can I butt in again?
Yep.
And say supervision has a sense of a definite routine to make sure things are happening, whereas mentorship seems to be a more voluntary thing from the point of view of the IMG asking for help when they want it. So is there a slight distinction there we need to work out?
I think, Martin, there would still be a requirement for regular meetings, etc. It just wouldn't be, for example, the 2 to 4 weeks working side by side with a supervisor, which is required currently under the very strict supervision requirements that's globally mandated at the moment. Graham. And sorry, I only get to see, there's 48 people online and I only get to see a snapshot. So if I don't see your hand go up, please button and tell me I'm being undemocratic and allocating speaking time.
Caitlin was first. Do you want to go, Caitlin?
Oh, thanks, Graham. I just also want to say, I just don't think, and I know it's been really hard on a big level, but I just don't think relying on someone being vocationally trained overseas is enough for a bigger picture thing. Each context is just so different, and relying on that to me seems a little bit risky. But I can understand there needs to be some sort of pathway to follow, but I think it needs to be more tailored and individualized.
Thank you, Graham.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to promote a mixed model. One, it may need to be localized to the individual practice or region. It needs to envisage a mixed model of supervision like Martin's talking about. And it's going to, the reality of workforce is if you tighten it down too tight, we don't have enough workforce just to fill the practices, let alone find a vocationally registered specialist. So we've got to be nimble and actually recognize there are rural practitioners with expertise that, you know, potentially with some level of accreditation can supplement the ideal of a fellow, everyone being managed by a fellow. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Sam had a hand up next, and then we'll go to Mark.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, as Caitlin was saying, different jurisdictions, like the Medical Council setting for this is a comparable health service is quite high level, and it means that they have a health service that has hospitals and maybe community service and community delivery of care. It's a health service that has a structure that's like a infrastructure that's similar to ours, and it's also a health service that has medical school training that's in universities or at a level that's around what ours is. So it's actually sort of like very vague in that as how the delivery of healthcare is in that community. And as Caitlin says, the delivery may be in a completely different frame, and people coming who might have done vocational training in their country, and it's a similar jurisdiction to New Zealand, will have a very different job from what we might have here. So even graduates coming from the UK may do general practice in a very different way. So I think there needs to be some, like Caitlin says, a little bit of flexibility to have bespoke or nuanced supervision based on how they go, and what that is to start off with and how long it lasts for is something that would probably need to be negotiated between the employer, the supervisor, and the trainee.
Thank you. Mark.
Thanks, Grant. My understanding was that the requirement, and this is speaking in response to Martin's point, was that we need to have a supervisor there for the whole week. And that's practically impossible in many cases, because there may not be a doctor other than the IMG that's there for the whole week. So in that case, we wouldn't ever be able to qualify for the conditions, so that eliminates practices that are in that situation. That seems counterproductive.
My understanding, Mark, is that's the requirement for a GPEP program with the college. It's not the requirement for IMG supervision beyond the first 2 to 4 weeks.
Well, that's not how it's been communicated to us, and that would be good to clarify that.
Yep, thank you. The other thing about the college, the Medical Council's current proposal that we do this according to registration pathway, from a organisation that places IMGs regularly, we get IMGs with full registration from the UK and others, have got fellowships similar to the RNZ GP, but they choose not to take the vocational pathway because they're coming to New Zealand only for 12 months or 18 months. And the cost of the vocation, the VOC3, VOC4 pathway is 5 times the cost of taking the comparable systems pathway. So, there's another factor to take into account. And, the conversation so far about a nuanced supervision plan based on the experience and skill of the specific person and the group they're going into makes more sense from my perspective. All right, good discussion. Oh, Jason.
Yeah, tēnā tātou. Thanks for this cordial this evening. Just a couple of points. Firstly, touching on the context points and things, for a lot of our rural communities, we have a lot of Māori who are in those communities as well. So it's important that the context regarding the data, marginalisation data, the context of the tiriti, all of those things that I'm not sure exactly how much NZREX or the IMGs have an idea about, because certainly when we're doing that sort of TG for our GPEP ones and going into the training and things, it's a part of it, but it's over the entire sort of 3-year course, whereas I'm not sure how much of that is being sort of given to our IMGs and is continuously over their training in terms of the supervision. So I think that's one thing that we kind of should be looking at as well, because a lot of our whānau who are in those communities not only have the rural inequity that happens, but also have the ethnic inequity that happens as well. So I think that's really important, especially if we're looking at that second part of the question, which I might not be able to be a part of because I've got another meeting at 7. But that 100 NZREX that are coming in as well. So that's one point. The second point I wanted to sort of bring up, coming back to your 26%, I think we need to look at those barriers for non-fellows who have been there, who don't want to go and do the vocational pathway, become fellows. I think that's another separate issue that we need to look into as well, and that might be in tandem with what's happening here. But if we can get that 26% who want to then go into fellowship, then that also solves some of the problems regarding supervision as well that we're having. So I guess those were just two sort of points I wanted to bring up before I never
Thanks,
get a chance.
Jason. Yeah, completely took your cultural safety points, and we'll make sure that they're integral to the feedback we put forward. Thank you. Question 3. To what extent is on-site supervision crucial? Any comments? Graham?
Yeah, Grant, I kind of direct this to Sam, perhaps, because we've had a very clear conversation about the supervision requirements and what's required for GPEP supervision, which is, that really needs someone that's within 20 minutes. Or, I mean, there's some very clear guidelines that the college has come up in that situation. Maybe we've got to start with that and work out whether we can modify that existing standpoint. Value your thoughts, Sam.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. I think this depends on the, like people have said, the nuance. I think, like Martin says, you've got a whole team around you. If you're working, usually you're not actually just a lone person in the middle of nowhere with no one else if you're an IMG. So one would expect nurses and reception and patients especially to tell you whether you're performing badly or not. The medical council requirements do say there needs to be early attention to poor performance. So therefore that would suggest that early on you need to be watching really closely. And then as the time goes on, the hands may come off. Remember, these people are meant to have done enough work recently enough in their own jurisdiction that they're qualified enough to actually do work in the environment that they've been put into in the work job that they've come for. So you'd have to have someone who's fairly glaringly bad to be going like, you need supervision on site, I'm watching everything you do. You do have to remember that general practice is probably the riskiest job, most complex job, and the job where someone shuts the door and does whatever they want inside a room that no one is necessarily watching. So how do we feel safe about that when we're supervising and there's a high level of trust that goes on, but you have to earn that trust to be able to be trusted at that high level. So I think that as nuanced, we might need to have a step process, and we need to think about how do we do it initially to make sure that people are covered. And if you're remote and you've got a team around you, then what are the parameters for that team to be watching, and then call into account the doctor who may have come from a very hierarchical service that does not respect what the receptionist, patient or nurse might say. So food for thought.
And just to clarify the GPEP requirements, because they're more stringent than even you've suggested, Graham. GPEP 1, it's on site all the time. GPEP 2 and 3, they've got to be able to get back to site within 5 to 10 minutes. Now,
can I just say, Grant, there's a paper that's, I don't know where it's got to, put together last year by our rural chapter around that on-site supervision and GPEP 2 and 3 and how that could be nuanced based on the skills and discussion with the supervisor and the trainee. So there is a little bit of nuance for rural that we're working on at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just using the published documents on your
Yeah.
website.
So it's just, yeah, it's just
I
coming
just
through.
yeah. don't think the reality would reflect the policy at the moment in many practices. So interesting. I'm sorry, Rangi, you're next in my screen for comment.
Kia ora. So I'm a medical centre manager and have been operating without a GP for the last 19 months.
Wow.
And we look after 4,500 patients.
Oh my God.
I think supervision on site is extremely important, especially when it comes to rural. So we work a lot with virtual, we work a lot with clinical oversight. So we're in the North Island, East Coast. Our clinical supervisor is in Queenstown. And the challenges that we find is, although we appreciate and are very grateful for the support, they do not understand our community. They do not fathom, purely because they are unaware, and that is okay, the distance it takes for whānau to get to an X-ray machine. The distance to a nearby hospital, an hour and a half away. So and I've been part of this medical centre for 7 years, and I have had fellows, and that has been pivotal to great international GPs coming into Aotearoa, because they build relationship with the community and they also educate about the community that they're servicing and providing care for. In the 19 months, we have not been able to close that gap with virtual support or supervision. So that's my partai on that.
Kia ora, thank you. Mark Smith.
Yeah, kia ora. Can you hear me all right there, Grant?
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
So, yeah, I'm probably just a couple of people behind now. I was just putting my hand up with response to what Sam talked about as well. So the college's rural chapter did do a bit of work last year around GP requirements for supervision, and landed with the fact that there needs to be more nuance than what you're seeing on the website. And I think Muireann put it in the chat. You know, you don't want to overrate someone coming into New Zealand, but you don't want to underrate them either. So it's really important to have an idea of that person's background and experience, and particularly also their background rurally and culturally. So, you know, some people may tick all the boxes clinically, but if they've never worked rurally or in a New Zealand cultural setting, then they may need some closer supervision for a period of time. If there was a way, as Muireann suggested, to sort of try and supervise that for a period to get an idea of then what do they need going forward in the following months, maybe that's a good way to go. So
Thanks, Mark. Good to know. Really appreciate that. Aisha.
Kia ora koutou. I'm Aisha Paulos, GP in Winton, Southland, and Muireann is our practice manager. So I'm echoing essentially what Mark and what Sam have said, that I think the answer to the question, does there need to be on-site supervision? I think it's a yes, without doubt. And I think there needs to almost be a set of standards where each individual can be almost assessed against. So at a 3-month point, otherwise you're going to get subjective and perhaps, you know, workforce pressured people saying, oh, yeah, this person's fine. And that set of standards, or those trained people who are trained to actually assess those, should be sort of a tight knit of well-trained and calibrated educators so we reduce that subjectivity. Because otherwise it just shows an ignorance in the understanding of general practice and how broad it is, and not understanding that actually everyone, and I'm from the UK, I'm London, but it is completely different. And when I came here and worked, and we have our Māori and our Pacific people population who have different needs, and you need on-site supervision, training and understanding.
Kia ora. Thanks, Aisha. AR.
Oh yeah, Andrew Austin here again, in Leaston. Look, I actually went reverse. I went from New Zealand to the UK, and over there it was compulsory. You had to do another GP registrar time, and so I had supervisors there, and that was actually quite useful. So, but as time goes on, you don't need them so much. And the IMGs that I've trained or used, to begin with, they need quite a lot of supervision, but as time goes on, they need less and less, and you can get away with just a phone call. I must say, with regard to you stating, following the college's kind of supervision for trainees, GPEPs. Look, I totally disagree. I think it discriminates against rural practices, and it needs to change. I think it needs to be a lot looser, actually. But there's my 2 cents worth.
Thank you. Appreciate. Helen.
Hi, thank you. I work alongside Mark as well. Just to say, we've had a practice that didn't have a GP, and we've gone through a kind of hybrid model. Sorry, excuse me. So it started out with on-site supervision, but has moved to virtual. And we include all of the team in part of the reporting. So that is the wider practice as well. So I don't think it's just one way for the entire journey. I think we have to look at the hybrid model and the inclusiveness of everybody in the practice.
Cool. Thanks for that. Whoever is Samsung SMG9, you're on. No. Samsung SM, are you there?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, can now, thanks.
Hi, Dr. Mohan here, GP from Waipokra. I'm just thinking the question in terms of IMG perspective, what would the IMG feel in terms of having whether on-site supervision or a combined or a hybrid model? Certainly, I have had few IMGs who work with me over the period of time, and they say, I mean, obviously the first 3 months is quite valuable for them to have on-site supervision. And then having other adjuncts like, all the feedback that we get from the part of the team, like 360-degree feedback, or it could be, online supervision and so forth, would be helpful. And that's the feedback that I've got from others. So a combined approach would be beneficial, but to start with on-site supervision for sure.
Thank you. Ariadna? Are you there, Ariadna? You may not have unmuted yourself if you're trying to speak.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, can now, thanks.
Oh, I'm so sorry, I could not get the mute on. My name is Ari. I'm an HCA on rural practice. I am an international medical graduate, and I've been in New Zealand for the last, 8 years. And I haven't found like a pathway towards going back to GP. But the only thing that what I want to contribute with this is that I think that supervision definitely would be something that an IMG would definitely need. With what you were saying about like having a hybrid like program, saying like regarding the skills or not skills of the medical professional, it's very important. And as well, somebody that it's already been involved in the culture, because the culture is very, very, very important. And you don't realize until you're being immersed on it and how important it is and the medical treatment of a patient regarding that. So like, I think that it's a really good thing that you guys are looking through this, because as well, like as being a person that it's been in New Zealand for this long, I've met a lot of medical doctors that have worked in already, or they are working as doing something else, and that could be utilized as resource in New Zealand if it's being put in the right pathway with the right supervision.
Sure, thanks, Ari. Geraldine's got a hand up and a old school approach. Go, Geraldine.
sorry about that. I'm not clever enough to be able to do the little hand thing. I can't actually see it down the bottom. But anyway, real hands as well as others. Has anybody sort of spoken or thought of speaking to some people who've been through the IMG program and how much supervision they felt that they needed, how the supervision worked out for them? I mean, we've certainly, Rex and I have certainly had a very successful IMG recently, and certainly I think after 6 months, we were pretty hands-off. But we're about to get another one who might need a lot more support. So I think getting their input could be helpful. Do other people think the same? Over and out. I'm going to unmute.
Thank you. It sounds like this nuanced approach, depending on the skills, experience, and often confidence of the IMG, will dictate a appropriate supervision program. Yeah. We'll go Mark, and then we'll go to you, Mark, first.
Thanks, Grant. There's no question in my mind. I'm not a clinician. There's a caveat. There's no question in my mind that there is a more intense supervision requirement in the early stages for an IMG. That's not at odds. But I guess the question becomes, are we happy to eliminate rural medicine as a locale for IMGs to settle? Because if we make it impossible, they won't be able to settle there.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's what we're dealing with. Martin, your thoughts?
I was just going to pick up first on Rangi's comment about needing to be familiar, for the supervisor to be familiar with the context. I cannot imagine adequate supervision of someone who has not at least visited the practice, met the team, knows the locality, and hopefully maybe stayed a couple of days to get the feel of how it ticks. And that would have to be factored in from a funding point of view as well, so that the supervisor can provide genuine supervision and not just tick box supervision. What Mark was talking about, yeah, I mean, we're all aware of the flagrant needs of rural practice, and the more remote, the more the need has been. And that's what we've been fighting now for 35 years, isn't it? So whatever system's put together, again, might need to be nuanced to make sure that the remote practice still has access to these people. It might be a stage thing whereby you start the IMG's experience in a non-rural or non-remote context, so that they can get some initial preparation, but continue with supervision in the remote setting along the lines of whatever we have discussed today is considered adequate and safe. And let's go a bit further, and enjoyable.
Yeah, thank you very much. Jason's about to leave, but Jason, just to let you know that I'll write up what I think the flavour of the discussions have been tonight and circulate that before I take them to the medical council discussions next week. Can I just read a comment that I got in written form from a rural practice, and I want your thoughts on this, because I think we've been dealing with many of the questions, and very quickly I'm going to go to NZREX, but let me read this out. Our feedback would be that those countries where the qualifications are close to New Zealand's, then a lighter touch of supervision than we currently have is all that is needed, and this could be 100% remote. We Clinically, the supervision currently falls to senior GPs, but there will be GPs who are not fellows, but who have significant experience and will be equally as good as a fellow. In our case, we have a UK GP who is a partner and GP teacher and UK fellow, but didn't feel a need to do a fellowship over here, yet he is an amazing teacher. This is some of these discussions that you've had about other members of the team who are not fellows, and I know that's a contentious issue, so interested in your thoughts here. The medical council requirements are always that the supervisor has to be a fellow of the specialty that they are training others in. Rangi.
I guess my feedback to that is it would be a better life source to rural practices if it didn't need to be a fellow. So I'm trying to look for a doctor, and as I mentioned, have been for 19 months. And I know there are hundreds out there, but now I'm looking in a puddle on a street because it has to be a fellow. For my practice to be sustainable for future, I need fellow supervision. So that narrows down the suitable.
Thank you. And I guess having the requirement for fellowship is a easy quality check, right? So how would you meet that quality check if not? Anyone got any other thoughts on that? None. So I'm assuming that the vast majority would believe that fellowship is important. Am I assuming the right thing here or not?
I would say absolutely, Grant. There's no question of that. It's just about the flexibility of how the service is provided and support is provided, because in my view, it's better to have a remote fellow providing that supervision and support than no ability to have someone in that locale at all.
Thanks, Mark. Graham?
Yeah, I mean, we forget that we should be we should be trusting the local team and the local population. The reality is we're never going to have enough fellows to supervise unless you're paying twice a session fee that they're going to earn in general practice doing their core work. You know, rural is hard pressed at the best of times. We have to be much more pragmatic. We can put some safety parameters in place, but creating a narrow gap of fellowship as the only trusted source of supervision basically is just going to compound the existing situation. We need to have some, a panel of people who we've worked through with that have got some basic parameters and around which they operate that's means tested and delivers, safe care to our populations. We can be idealistic, but if we were going to be able to deliver that, we would have delivered it by now.
Well, it's caused a flurry of hands, so thanks, Graham. Let's go to Helen. You had your hand up next, I think.
So I just want to say we shouldn't underestimate the skill that we have in the other clinicians in the practice, which is a little bit to what you're saying. Their knowledge of the local community pathways, the nursing team. If you've got a solid team within the practice, the support and skill that those other people, non-fellow GPs, NPs, we've got some great senior nurses around, and their knowledge should never be underestimated. It's a team approach to orientating and supporting an IMG into practice. It's not just about one fellow mentor supervisor. It's about the entire practice on that journey in that support. So I think we shouldn't ever underestimate everybody else in the journey.
Thank you. Brendan Marshall?
Thanks, Grant. Just a contribution from the coast. I think almost what you've heard and what I think has played out is it's a summation of factors that have been set, which when put together make it almost impossible to supervise. So there's definitely value and there's things that are fellow adds. And I realise I talk from a position of advantage as a salaried workforce, but we often already provide that in a networked way. So what you have on the ground in the practice and who actually can provide the most, because much of what your problems will be, and it's identified in research time and again, particularly people who've been fellows in their own country, it's rarely the clinical acumen or the clinical skills, it's the cultural adaptation or the communication skills. And there's many other people that can both feed back on that and continue. So I think that the problem is that, and there could well be someone from council on here, but a lot of these things are written from an urban lens, like a lot of our regulations across Aotearoa, and what we really need is rural having major input. So any or all of the bits that are in there are probably help make up a really good transition, but it's putting them all in as a requirement. It must be on site. It must be 24/7. It must be really intense for the first. It just means you're setting rural up for failure. No one ever ends up in these places because it's just too hard to onboard and almost impossible to employ.
Thank you. Rangi?
My feedback was, I appreciate the accolade of a fellow, but it is a problem within rural. Is really hard to find. And then having employed many international GPs, and this is hand on heart, in 13 years, not one from Barcelona, the UK, and I've employed probably 1 to 2 a year pre-losing all the GPs. China, the country list is long. Not one of them has chosen to take up the New Zealand fellowship. So I think ask the question why. But then also this is an opportunity to pivot. So is fellow not the answer? Is that an old school system that we are trying to grasp at? Is this an opportunity to say, hey, it's time for something new? Could it be like train the trainer? Could it be that form of qualification? Because there are many practitioners, NPs, registered nurses who could be supporting this. And should they do a train the trainer or, I don't know, some other qualification that can be created rather than fellowship, so that we can better resource our rural communities?
Thanks, Rangi. And Graham in the chat has put down supervision accreditation, which is sort of what you're talking about, but who accredits the supervisor? So there are issues with that as well. All right, I know I've already used your time up. This has been really good conversation, thank you. And you can see there are a range of views here, and we acknowledge all of those. Can I just change to the second part of the question? If, and the government is going to be creating pathways for NZREX graduates, and we had Ari on before. So these are 100 places in general practice. How, and forget supervision now, what are the other barriers for those people to be able to succeed in an NZREX general practice pathway through rural practices?
Immigration New Zealand.
What do you mean, Mark? Because Immigration New Zealand's allowed them into the country and they're driving Ubers and, you know, working in hospo while they wait for a pathway to get qualified.
Yeah, that's our problem. But I'm talking about the fact that when we've got an identified candidate, I've had an example where between the Medical Council and Immigration New Zealand, they messed the candidate around so long that after 18 months, he pulled out and gave up. And he was signed up with a contract, ready to work in New Zealand, permanently reside here, experienced doctor, fantastic background, totally committed. And we spent a lot of money and time and energy doing that. And it was incredibly frustrating that our bureaucracy got in the way of that. And then we plead that we're so short of GPs. It just seems that we're doing ourselves in the eye here.
Thank you. Caitlin?
Don't sound too negative, the unions, but the RDA, who we ran into issues with community-based attachments, and essentially it's going to be the same kind of concept. So I think I'd be not saying it pointed at them exactly, but just, I guess, the rules of allowing them to work. Accommodation, if it's a relatively short term, because I think my understanding is it's only like 6 months as part of their 24-month journey. So that can be pretty hard for relocation costs and accommodation support, and probably funding for supervision. I know it's not supervision itself, but still the funding that goes with it is important. And I guess support for their whānau if they're bringing along other people with them, because typically they tend to be older and probably more established in life.
Thank you. Great points. Ari?
In my experience, I came to New Zealand not obviously to pursue my medical career, but I find it that the main challenges that I had regarding like being able to carry on with my medical career was a lot of bureaucracy and cost for the international medical graduate to actually go back into, practicing. I am very fortunate that I am bilingual in things, but I come from a others language speaking country, which obviously that makes it a little bit of more complicated situation as well. So like there's a lot of barriers that are not only cultural, there's a lot of barriers on the like living kind of cost that is coming into a different country that's so far away from everything else. And on top of that, you get all the challenges that it's put in front of you because of bureaucratic procedures, etc., etc. Like I understand that there's a reason why they did, but I feel that it could be more streamlined to be making it more attractive to people that are actually trained to be able to practice in the rural areas of New Zealand that really, really need them.
Thank you. Beyond this session tonight, Ari, if you could specify where those costs lie, be great to get that feedback, but thank you. AR, we'll go to you. Sorry, I don't know your name.
Andrew, yeah.
Andrew, thank you.
I guess my understanding from your comments earlier were that NZREX candidates are paid and they're in our practice and we're training them. So, a quantum of funding similar to what the registrars are getting, because they need to have that sort of level of supervision and training. I would spend an hour each week, probably an hour and a half doing training, and then there's all the paperwork and supervision you need to do. So that would be probably one of my suggestions.
How much do you receive, sorry, Andrew, for supervising a registrar?
So it's around $20,000 per year.
Thank you. Cool. Rangi?
Some of the barriers that we've come across is, so have lost a husband and wife GP from Minnesota. They were here for 5 years. They got New Zealand residency. And they did a big trip back home. The wife's registration had lapsed during that time, and she had to go through vigorous process to get it back, and it was the exact same process 5 years ago. And she thought, no, stuff you, I've already paid enough. I've given this country 5 years, and I've got residency, and now I have to go through this because their holiday went too long. So that they've now live back in the US. I had another husband and wife team from the UK. I don't know if everybody knows this, but some UK GPs, they'll do 6 months in New Zealand and 6 months back at home. So they had made the decision that they would move to New Zealand. However, the bank won't give them a very small bank loan for a mortgage because they're over the age of 55. Both of them are in their late 50s and said that they were looking at practicing till they were 65, 70. Both had glowing references and are probably known in the community, like as in GP community. Another one is support navigating immigration. The support that is believed to be given in New Zealand is not what the clinician overseas is expecting, or they're still struggling with the support that they need because of communication, time difference, or walking alongside them. It's more so, I'll flick you an email, attend this seminar, but they're actually wanting someone to walk alongside them. If they choose that, they have to pay for it themselves. So those are the three main barriers that we have come across.
Thank you. Unsolicited plug for NZ locums, government funded. We'll walk beside any locums that we're bringing into the country at no cost at all. So just letting you know that.
I promise you didn't pay me to say that, Grant, as I literally put that in the chat.
Oh, did you? Thank you. A lot of people are not aware of the service we offer, rural practices. Andrew, have you got your hand up still, or is that a remnant from last time? Gone. Okay, look, I've used up all, oh, Veronique.
Just quickly, there's a study that we did ages ago, and we looked at rural recruitment and retention, and some of the issues were things like employment for the other half, if, you know, for instance, they're not a GP, and availability of schools. So if they were coming to a rural area, where is the closest school? Would they then have to send their kids off to boarding school, for instance? That kind of thing. People may not be aware they come to a rural area and they don't have that infrastructure around them.
Thank you.
That's all I was going to say on that.
Appreciate that. Graham?
I think we don't have to reinvent the wheel. The challenge of an NZREX placement is no different than a 4th year, 5th year, 6th year registrar placement. The evidence that that came out of Ontario is that if we can get our communities involved, that there's funding for adequate transport, accommodation, engagement, and inclusiveness of that individual into the community, then you're far better able to support them and retain them. I mean, I think it was raised earlier, but my discussions with Joe Scott Jones with the Waikato pilot was that, some of the requirements for in-hospital attachment and having to travel backwards and forwards to meet those requirements, not just the GP placement, accommodation, transport costs, just basic living costs. If it's not supported adequately, as our registrars are already inadequately supported compared to their hospital colleagues, then it's a non-starter because the barriers are too great.
Thank you. Look, I really appreciate all the comments tonight now, and I'm aware there's a large number of people who've said nothing, and as a hardened introvert myself, it's often hard to break into these conversations. So feel free to email me with any thoughts you have, however weird or disparate you may think they are. My email is simply grant.davidson@htrhn.org.nz, and Graham's put his email address in the chat. Be great to have your comments. We'll write up the general themes from this and run it past you. We're getting a copy of the Waikato NZREX pilot that we can circulate as well when we receive that, so learnings from that can be incorporated into our recommendations going forward. Really appreciate it. Hope that was useful. And again, looking forward to further contact. But unless there's an immediate thing, I'll let you get on with your night, and I'll close with karakia. e tau mai te manaki o te wahingaro, mai runga, mai raro, mai roto, mai waho, hui e tāki e. Take care, everyone. Thanks again for the great